Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to the channel. There has been a lot of news in the last 24 hours regarding the potential fixing of fights within the UFC and betting integrity regarding UFC fights. Some sports books in Canada has completely pulled being able to bet at all on UFC fights because of integrity in the fights, basically saying we're not sure if there's insider information, if these fights are being rigged somehow. The majority of this news is surrounding MMA coach and former UFC fighter James Krause. And we're going to go through the entire timeline because there's a lot to recap. This story has kind of been evolving over the past 2 to 3 months. A lot of people kind of saw something like this eventually coming. It didn't look pretty for James Krause as of a month ago or so. And now we actually have a little bit of information and something I've never seen before. We're seeing an MMA coach effectively excommunicated from the entire sport of MMA. And is that justified? The investigation isn't completed. I mean, this story is absolutely crazy because if something comes, to light within this story that proves for 100% certainty that there has been a fixed fight in the UFC, regardless if the UFC did it, I think that can completely ruin the sport of MMA, even with the UFC brand behind it. I've been talking about it for a long time. I'm saying the UFC would never fix a fight because it would ruin their business model if it ever got out. So we're going to talk about all that. We're going to go through the entire timeline. I'm going to answer the question whether or not I think the UFC's ever fixed fights. Has there ever been any other fixed fights outside of, the one fight that's mainly being discussed right now, the Darrick Minner fight? But let's first start off August 1st on the MMA Hour. And this isn't really super relevant to the story, but this is an important piece of it. James Krause goes on the biggest MMA show there is out there, the MMA Hour, and brags, I bet on every single fight, on every single event. I make so much money from betting. I have a Discord with all these members that I charge, $50 a month or $2,000 a month, determining how many bets they get from me. And then everyone makes a bunch of money, and I make more doing that than I do coaching. Well, that statement, while it isn't illegal, it just kind of shows a conflict of interest considering he's coaching a lot of these fighters. So now he has that vested interest where he could essentially place a big bet, get one of his fighters to then throw a fight and rake in a lot of money. But nothing about this interview outside of it was just, kind of rubbed people the wrong way and brought light onto James Krause because everyone knew he did this, but now he's going on the biggest MMA show there is and just shouting from the rooftops about it. It just kind of put him under a little bit more scrutiny. Then you have October 17th. The UFC put out a statement. I'll put it on the screen. I'm not going to read the entire thing, but essentially what they said is, we're updating our code of conduct policy and no UFC fighters are allowed to bet on any fights, even if they are not involved in that fight. So no UFC fighter is allowed to gamble on any MMA fights anymore within the UFC, which was massive news at the time. I mean, the UFC's always said, we have independent contractors. We're only paying these guys X amount, and they're free to do whatever they want. They can say whatever they want and do all this. Now they're coming out and saying, look, no UFC fighters can bet anymore. And that's because people were really looking into these different things and seeing these conflict of interest and saying, okay, is there some integrity problem within betting just for the UFC exclusively? Then you have November 5th, and this is the massive moment in this entire story. You have Darrick Minner, who is coached by James Krause of Glory MMA, fighting Shayilan Nuerdanbieke. And this fight didn't really last particularly long. It lasted a little over a minute. Darrick Minner got finished, in the first round via TKO. But what's suspicious about this fight is Darrick Minner, in his early movements, appeared to have a leg injury or a knee injury of some sort. Then he blasts a body kick. It's quite apparent that he has some type of injury. There was speculation on the broadcast. Maybe he injured it with that kick. Nuerdanbieke starts to press forward. He then throws that same kick. He's clearly injured. And then it basically leads to the TKO finish for Shayilan Nuerdanbieke. And while that in its, in entirety there doesn't sound super crazy. I mean, TJ Dillashaw just did it against Aljamain Sterling. What was suspicious is there was massive line movement in the betting odds. People were putting massive amounts of money on Nuerdanbieke. and it was suspicious. They picked it up as suspicious in the hours leading up to the fight. So what that told these sports books were essentially somebody was tipped off by an insider that Darrick Minner came into this fight with a knee injury, and basically it was a rigged fight in their opinion, and basically they were getting scammed out of the money. Well, immediately afterwards, there was really, there was some coverage of it. Aaron Bronstetter, who did a lot of coverage on the sports books in Canada, did a scrum with Dana White where he really pressed the issue. This was like the following week, right before UFC 281. And I'm going to put a clip here where you can really see Bronstetter asking Dana about it and Dana essentially just brushing it off. Check this out.
The UFC recently sent a memo out to all of the fighters about betting on sport, not being allowed to bet on sports. This past weekend, there was an investigation launched on the Minner and Shayilan fight because the line movement went crazy in the hours leading up to the fight. Right. What can you do to even further safeguard the integrity of the sport when this kind of thing happens?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things. There's absolutely zero proof that anybody that was involved bet on it. So it's just, there was some, there was some signs out there that something was going on, but there's absolutely no proof that anybody did anything wrong. And hopefully by seeing this again in this investigation, it deters people from doing it, from betting on it.
So there you have Dana White essentially just brushing it off. There's no evidence that anybody did anything wrong. And there's more to this clip. This was a scrum where Aaron Bronstetter, who works for TSN in Canada, was just grilling Dana White. And he asked very good follow-up questions. If you want to find the entire clip, I've retweeted, his clip of this scrum interview, whatever you want to call it. It's on my Twitter, at MMAJoeyC. But he continued to grill him. And basically Dana just brushes it off and says there's no evidence. But then he goes and say, well, maybe this investigation will, stop people from doing this in the future. Well, how does that make any sense? If nobody did anything wrong, then why would you continue to do an investigation if there's no evidence? You've had, a little while to look into it and there's no evidence of any wrongdoing, then why are you continuing to look into it? What Dana should have said is, look, we're looking into it. We're going to get to the bottom of it. But as of right now, we don't have any evidence that any one particular person did anything wrong. That's what he really should have said, because the suspicious betting line movement is an indication that something is going on. Somebody was tipped off about Darrick Minner's knee injury going into the fight, and either a group of people or one person betted a lot of money for Darrick Minner to lose. Okay, then you fast forward to November 19th. New Jersey essentially said, look, we're not accepting any bets on James Krause managed fighters or coached fighters. We don't want to take any bets that have anything to do with James Krause, which was massive. And then you have, and I think it was UFC Vegas 65, like the following week or whatever it was, you have the UFC has Miles John come out. He wins a fight via decision, and he says, you know what? My cornerman, my head coach, was banned from coming to the event. So this was other big news. Okay, what's going on here now? Now James Krause isn't even allowed to attend a UFC event anymore. If there's no wrongdoing going on, why is that allowed? Then you also have on, I think it was November 24th, James Krause, who has that, we talked about it, that massive Discord. He has a YouTube channel called the 1% Club. They disappear. They completely disappear. He deletes both of them, which shows me this investigation is getting close to him. And whether it be by his lawyers or whoever else, he decides to go out and delete his YouTube channel and delete his Discord. Well, that kind of, I don't want to say this is an indication of guilt, but that's awfully suspicious to me, because if I did nothing wrong, I wouldn't be deleting that. And then he's just made absolutely no statement. So there's something going on here. Then you have the biggest news, which was yesterday, December 2nd. Ontario has decided to ban betting on UFC because of betting integrity issues. They put out a statement, and then you have Alberta right behind them saying we're not taking any bets on UFC fights anymore pending an investigation. Then you have the UFC come out. Right after this news is announced from the, places in Canada who are no longer taking UFC bets, they come out and release a statement. And I'm not going to read the entire thing. I'll put it on the screen. But effectively what they say is UFC has since advised Krause and respective managers working with impacted fighters that effective immediately, fighters who choose to continue to be coached by Krause or who continue to train in his gym will not be permitted to participate in UFC events pending the outcome of the aforementioned government investigations. Further, UFC has released Darrick Minner from the organization. So now that statement from Dana White that I showed you a little bit ago, there's no evidence that anything happened. It's starting to look a whole lot like the UFC is acting like something happened. Because why would they say no fighters can even train with James Krause? I understand they say he can't be a cornerman. They're not going to let him be in the corner at their UFC events. But they're flat out saying, look, we're ending this guy's career. He is no longer permitted to even train with any fighters that want to fight in the UFC. And this could be a massive mistake by the UFC. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But that is craziness. I don't know what evidence they have against James Krause. I don't know, did he tip off somebody? Was it as insidious as he said, look, this guy's injured. He's going to go down in the first round. He knows, bet X amount of money on him and then we'll split the profits. Was it something that bad? Or could James Krause have just mentioned to someone, he's hanging out with all these people who are into gambling, who are into MMA betting. Minner's injured, and it just got out and it ended up getting, told around. And then a bunch of people just bet against him because of that information. We don't know. But the fact that they are saying, look, James Krause is effectively excommunicated from the sport. He can no longer make a living. They must have something. And for me, when I initially heard these claims, when these claims first came out about Darrick Minner, I thought to myself, there's no way that somebody like James Krause would be that stupid. So I still find it hard to believe that he went out of his way to fill people in. He knows what goes on in betting and gambling. He knows that these suspicious betting activities or, these line movements are going to be picked up. And then he knows that if Darrick Minner goes out there and shows that he's injured, he's going to be caught red-handed. So I still find it hard to believe, but it could be very well possible that James Krause knew Darrick Minner was injured. He had no discussion with Darrick Minner, but he just told people, look, he's probably going to lose. He's injured. He's going in injured. And that's why we had all this suspicious betting line movement. But if it is something more insidious, if let's say Krause knew he was injured, said, look, I want you to go down in the first round. We're friends. I'm going to bet X amount. I'm going to bet $150K that you get TKO'd in the first round. We'll share the profits, whatever that may be. It may have been $500,000. And who knows if the bets actually got placed or not because, these sports books picked up on the suspicious activity. But that would be massive. Because essentially, forget that it involves Krause. Forget that it involves Minner. The headline will be, UFC has a fixed fight. Oh my God, how detrimental would that be to the sport? I've talked about it time and time again. After every kind of weird occasion where there's a weird decision or weird stoppage or weird this or weird that, people come out in droves and say, this fight was fixed. That fight was fixed. And I've always said, because people are saying the UFC is fixing these fights. I've always said the UFC would not fix a fight for anyone. I don't believe, this is my personal opinion, they're not going to fix a fight for Conor McGregor. They're not going to fix a fight for, John Jones. They're not going to fix a fight for any of their big stars. GSP, Anderson Silva back in the day, they're not going to do it. Because the consequences of the UFC being caught red-handed fixing a fight would be massive for the sport. People would stop watching. I am one of the most hardcore fans there is. If I found out the UFC was actively fixing fights, I wouldn't watch the sport anymore. It's basically pre-scripted now at this point. I might as well go watch WWE if that's what I'm into. So this could literally ruin the sport. I don't think it's going to necessarily, depending on what comes out. I just find it hard to believe there's going to be concrete information that Krause and Minner conspired to throw this fight to make large sums of money. But I've always said the UFC, I don't think the UFC is fixing fights. I thought it would be at a more of a micro level where it would be one fighter deciding, okay, telling their mother or father, go put $500,000 on me and I'm going to go out there and lose. Or I said, with the Amanda Nunes, Juliana Pena first fight, I said, look, it wouldn't surprise me if Pena told one of her family members, go put this large sum of money on me to lose with the odds as crazy as they were. I don't believe this happened, but I'm just saying, if there is fixed fights in the UFC, it's going to be at such a small level. And I'm not saying it doesn't involve big fights. I'm just saying only it's going to be one or two people knowing, because otherwise it's going to get out. And if James Krause involved a large group of people here, it's going to get out. And if James Krause really did this and they find hard, concrete evidence, the UFC is going to do everything in their power to absolutely destroy him. I mean, he's already excommunicated from the sport, essentially. And, what's he going to do now? I don't know. And I don't think it's fair. They're saying, oh, well, he can't coach anyone because we're doing an investigation. How is that fair? What if this man is completely innocent? I tend to believe it could go either way. I feel like the UFC wouldn't be dumb enough to impose these sanctions unless they had some sort of smoking gun at this point already. But if he is innocent, or if, there's not evidence to prove that he's guilty, how are you going to end his MMA coaching career? How is that fair? And I feel like they shouldn't be able to do this until they have concrete evidence, until this investigation is concluded. But if he did, he made a massive mistake. I don't know where he would go from there. And he could potentially end up in jail. This is a serious charge. This is a serious charge of fraud. The government regulates betting, all these sports books. And they're going to, UFC, with all their money and all their power, are going to press for the stiffest possible punishment for James Krause legally and then within their power, like they're already doing, because of how much this is going to hit their brand. If it comes out there was a fixed fight in the UFC, even if it was at this micro level of just James Krause tipping off people and saying that Darrick Minner was injured, those headlines are not going to be good for the UFC. And it's going to be a shit stain on the UFC brand for years to come. People are going to use it as evidence to say, oh, look at these judges, look at these judges with these terrible scorecards. They're probably being paid off or something along those lines. So what the UFC is going to try to do is they're going to try to get the stiffest possible punishments for James Krause. And that way they can say, look, we figured it out. We have a zero tolerance policy for this. And look where this guy is now. He's in jail for 10 years. He's no longer ever able to participate in the sport in any, way. And we've dealt with it. And that's the way they're going to try to rehab this story a little bit in their favor. But also this could backfire on the UFC a little bit. James Krause coaches a lot of notable UFC fighters, one being Brandon Moreno. And I know he doesn't have that massive star in Conor McGregor or Nate Diaz or even, a litany of stars under his coaching banner. But some of these fighters, if they believe that James Krause is innocent, they may say, look, I'm not uprooting my life. You want me to change gyms on a moment's notice? How is that fair? I don't think that's fair to the fighters at all. Say James Krause can't come to events. But how are you going to say you can't train with him? Now you're regulating my life when I'm off the clock because I'm an independent contractor? These fighters may stand with him if they believe that he is innocent. They may say, look, we're not fighting that. And I know the UFC would just next man up and they would move on. But, that would be massive. Imagine if Brandon Moreno, who I'll put up the screenshot right now, he put up a picture of him and James Krause, and he said, waiting for justice. Brandon Moreno is a massive name, probably the biggest name under James Krause. And if these fighters think that their coach is innocent and they stand by him, that's a lot of fighters that the UFC aren't going to have at their disposal for some of these shitty fight night cards they like to put on every single week. So I think this could backfire a little bit. I think the UFC will recover regardless. But if he turns out to be innocent, how that's going to be an equally bad look on the UFC. So you destroyed this guy's career for 6 months, a year, however, maybe forever. The stain on his name is going to be there forever. And I could see if James Krause is not proven guilty or found guilty of anything, he's going to be pissed. And he's probably going to sue the UFC, and then they're going to have some type of settlement between each other. This is going to be massive. Regardless of the way that this entire situation goes, it's going to be huge news because the UFC fixing fights just in the headlines. I know Dana White is infuriated. I know the entire, top staff of the UFC is infuriated. And they're trying to get as far away from this as possible. I'm curious, how it all ends up, ending. But that's all the information we really have for now. So let me know what you guys think is going to happen with this. Is James Krause going to end up getting found guilty? Would the UFC even impose these sanctions against him if they didn't think he was guilty of something? I'm genuinely curious what you guys think. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.